So today we're going to be reading from Numbers 34, 16 to 29. So in today's passage, we see this long list of names, right? And it's like a lot of passages in Numbers, it's just a list. And sometimes when we read this, we might be thinking like, what is the Lord trying to tell us today? Well, I think in today's passage, the really important central theme of what God is trying to tell us today is leadership, the importance of leadership in the community. Now, in this context, the Israelites are getting ready to enter into the promised land. This is the land that they've all been waiting for. This is essentially what Numbers is leading into, right? All of Numbers is just about the Israelites being commanded by God to prepare for their entry into the promised land. And now as they're getting ready to enter, the Lord gives this command to Moses on how to divide up the land. Right? It's finally getting to that point where now they're getting ready to receive the land, and they're just trying to figure out how exactly are they to split it. Now, the Lord commands Moses to appoint leaders, and of course, obviously, the most, central of that leadership is Eleazar, the high priest, and Joshua, right, the man who was supposed to replace Moses. And this seems, kind of obvious, right? We've kind of read up until this point about how Eleazar, the son of Moses, will now take, or the grandson of Moses will, or Aaron, the grandson of Aaron, is replacing and taking his place as the priest. And recently we've read that Joshua is now going to be the man to replace Moses. And so we have these two key figures, right? Just like Aaron and Moses led the Israelites, the next generation will be led by Eleazar the priest and Joshua, the guy who is going to kind of take the central role of leadership. But then we see God commands Moses to appoint several other leaders in the Israelites' community. One leader from each tribe is to come out and assist Eleazar and Joshua to divide up the land. And now when we see this, I think there's two things that we can really take out from this message, this passage. I think when we look at who God appoints as leaders, it tells us as a community what kind of leaders we're supposed to call up, send out, and to really call into a position of leadership. These people that God appoints, when we read this list, we might be tempted to think that God is just appointing random people, whoever he sees, available to call into leadership, right? And sometimes in church, right, we might even be tempted to think that, right? For me, growing up, I think in my early 20s, up until recently, a few years ago, I was attending a very small church. And I remember when I first went to that church, I think we had maybe like 5 people in our EM. And that's really difficult if you've ever been in that kind of situation to really function as a church. And I remember the first Sunday I walked into that building, my the leader who was serving in that church, he asked me, "Hey, do you want to serve in leadership?" First day into the building, and they asked me that. And so in a small church, you can't help but kind of ask for help wherever you can, right? And while definitely there is a need for help in church, right? I truly believe that those who are called into leadership, they have a higher standard they have to follow, right? Now, when we read this list of people from today, they might seem like just anybody, but if you look into the names of the people, we kind of see what kind of people they really are. So, for example, right, and from the list we have Shemuel, and translated into English, that name means his name is God, right? Elidad, God loves. Haniel, grace of God. Kemuel, God establishes. Elizaphan means my God protects. And Paltiel, right, it says my deliverance is God. These names that these leaders have, right? They're not just anybody, but they're people whose very names are dedications and worship towards God, right? Now, just because their names mean this doesn't necessarily mean that, they might be these kind of people, but, in that culture, right, when a parent names somebody, their child, a certain name, right, you would imagine that they probably, raised them and, taught them and trained them to live a life, similar to how they were dedicated as a child, right? Just like how many of our parents, as they, dedicate their children at a young age to God and, raise them a certain way, we can expect that these leaders that God has appointed, given their names, are also people who follow along in that kind of that upbringing, that dedication to the Lord. And so we see that these people are a people dedicated to God, a people who wants to love God and worship God based on their names. Now, we see that, these people who are called to leadership, they're just, you might be wondering, they're just, being assigned to just divide up land, right? So why would such, a menial task, such a, mundane task require, such dedication, right? You might expect that from the priest and the leader of the community, right? You might expect that kind of standard from a pastor or a Sunday school teacher, but maybe you're wondering, if I'm just doing, random things at church, right? If I'm, just being assigned to tasks that doesn't seem like it's all that important, then do I have to have that same kind of dedication? And I would say yes, right? No matter what our position in church is, no matter what we do, whether it's an official position of leadership or whether you're just helping out on Sundays, I think it's important that when we do so, in any form of leadership, any form of way of serving in the church, right? There's a requirement to a certain standard, right? In Acts chapter 6, when the apostles first appoint the deacons in the church, right? They're not being appointed to be, preachers of the word. They're not being appointed to lead the community as pastors, but, they're being called up to serve tables, right? To the widows. And we might be wondering, like, that's such a, a boring, kind of, not so fancy job that we might think of in the church. But there's a very key requirement that the apostles look for, and it says that these people are filled with the Spirit, right? This might seem like such a, unimportant task, something that might not require, holiness as one might expect, right? Or righteousness, or to be filled with the Spirit. But the apostles very specifically looked for people who are filled with the Spirit in this position, right, to serve tables. Now, as leaders, whatever we do, right, whether it be preaching on Sundays, whether we're leading worship, whether we're on media teams, serving, making slides or doing sound check, right, whether we're planning for, events or welcoming people into the church, these are all positions of leadership, whether we see it or not, right? And no matter what the task is, they all require us to be a certain type of people, a type that God is pleased with, a type that serves God and worships God and dedicates ourselves to God. We can be doing all kinds of things, but whatever the task is, if we're before God on Sunday, serving His people, serving His community, and we're not filled with the Spirit, we're not following in God's commands, if we're not, these type of people that God would want to call into leadership, right? What kind of impact would that have on the church, on the community, right? On the people? Could you imagine if you're serving tables, for example, as the deacons did, and you weren't filled with the Spirit? How would you love the people that you're called to love? Right? We might be wondering, right? How can I? How does that affect how I serve? I used to do PowerPoint slides for like 7 years, and I used to think, this is just a job where I just need to make slides. It doesn't really matter, how I do it. This is just, I don't need to be a certain type of person to do this. But, as I, prepared these slides with that kind of mindset, I realized, my heart, even though it's just, just a task where no one even sees me, right? I realized that even a task like that, is so different based on what your heart is for God and for the people, right? If I'm creating slides without any care, carelessly, right? If I'm creating these slides without thinking about how can I serve the community, I'll create it however I want, right? But then as I thought about how can I serve the people of the community, right, of the church, with this, task that I'm given, right, with this job of creating slides, right, I realized, maybe I can create the slides to be more readable, right, or make it so that for people who don't know the songs, right, I can serve them in this way, and make sure that they receive the lyrics beforehand, right, so that I'm not too late in changing the slides. It's like small things like this that doesn't seem like it's a big deal. But when our hearts are filled with love for the church, right, for God, for the community, and we're leaders who are filled with the Spirit, right, these tiny things make a difference. And even though you might not think that they're appreciated or seen, even if you think no one notices, right, God uses each and every one of us in very mighty ways. Even in small ways where we think might not make a difference. How we serve as leaders make a huge impact on the people in the church. And so, there's a reason why God requires specific people, this type of person, right? And I imagine how He uses you as a leader, regardless of your position, regardless of your duties and responsibilities, right? That makes a difference. Your heart for the Lord, your heart for the people. It's such a crucial aspect of leadership. Right? And so for those of us who are called into leadership, right, we have to follow the standard. We have to, really ask ourselves, how can I dedicate myself to God in this small task that I have, right? No task is too small for the church, right? We have a huge responsibility, each and every one of us, to really serve the community in every way that we can, to the best that we can, through being filled with the Spirit. Now, as we talk about leaders, right, and their importance in the community, I also believe that as the everyday member, right, the lay members of the church, we also have a responsibility to our leaders. Just as it is important for our leaders to be filled with the Spirit, I also believe that as the people who are being led, right, the people who are, quote unquote, just attending on Sundays, just not really having to do any responsibilities, but just being regular members of the church, we also have a responsibility to our leaders. Right? In Hebrews chapter 13, right, the author says, remember your leaders, right, and follow their example. Right? The author of Hebrews encourages us to really love our leaders, right, to respect our leaders, to follow their leadership. And I'm not just saying this so that people will just listen to what I have to say, right, and to just go along with whatever I say. I'm not saying that you have to go along with everything that I say, but I believe that as people of the church, as a community, God has appointed these leaders, whether it be pastors, teachers, worship leaders, our ministry teams, whoever it may be. God has appointed these people, just as we see in today's passage, like the tribe leaders. God has appointed our leaders, and ultimately, any authority, any kind of role of leadership that they have comes from God. And so for us, as members of the church, it's so crucial that we follow in their leadership, that we respect them and we love them and care for them, because ultimately they are an extension of God's commands. They're an extension of God's leadership to this church, right? But when the community, right, follows and loves their leaders, right, if we are to love, our pastors, our teachers, our worship leaders as a community, appreciate them for all that they do, right, and love them as a leader, right, makes it so much easier for us, right. It says in Hebrew that to love and respect your leaders so that they can do their work with joy, right. There's nothing more demoralizing as a leader, right, if you aren't supported by the people that you're leading, if you aren't loved by the people that you're leading, right? And obviously, as leaders, they're called to love you no matter what, the response we get from people are, right? But, just as, an encouragement to all of our leaders, right, to all of our members, it's so important to, love and, follow our leaders because, right, everybody in this church, right, everyone who leads in some capacity, they do so out of a love for all of us, right? no one's being forced to lead here, right? No one is kind of, leading out of, obligation. Everyone here is leading and serving in some capacity because they genuinely love our church, because they genuinely love each and every one of our members, right? And so I believe as a community and as a church, it's so important for us to honor and love these leaders, because I believe, that's what God wants from the community. That's what God, hopes to see, a leadership that loves the church, and a church and the members that love the leadership. I believe, this communion and this fellowship and this love is the exact imagery that, God wants to see in the church, right? And so, as I wrap up today, this passage, again, I believe speaks to two things, right? As a leadership, how are you following in God's, in His requirements for leadership, right? Do you see leadership, responsibilities in the church as just another thing to do, an extracurricular activity maybe, just one thing to make yourself feel good about yourself? Or are you really seeing it as an opportunity to serve the church? Are you following in the examples of God, the way that He loves His community, His people? Are you loving the same way? Are you filled with the Spirit so that, whether it be just serving tables, that you can really serve God and glorify God through your serving? And then for our members, for our people who might not be leaders, are you showing love and respect to your leaders? Are you honoring them? Are you giving them the care that they need? As a community, are you uplifting our leaders and making sure that we can be a godly community that loves? So as we end, I just want to pray. Let us reflect on these things.